Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Red Room Stories. I know many of you tune into these tales to help you drift off to sleep. So, before we settle in, I'd love for each of you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. And if you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to give a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. In 1988, I was 15 years old, living at home with my parents Paul and Jeanette, and my two younger brothers Adrian, who was 12, and Jamie, who was nearly 10. That year, my grandmother Colleen moved in with us after my grandfather Roger passed away. She didn't like living alone, and we were happy to have her. However, space quickly became an issue. After about 6 months, my parents decided we needed a bigger house, so they started looking for a new home that could fit all of us comfortably. They found a house in Woking, a large 3-story home built around 1900. It had an attic, a separate garage, and a few outbuildings that we kids were excited to explore. The house needed some work, but it was livable, just a bit of rewiring and repainting for safety. My parents and grandmother were eager to take on the project, and we all looked forward to having our own rooms. My parents placed Gran in the ground floor guest room, took a room on the first floor, and we kids got our own rooms on the second floor. There was even a spare room with 2 single beds for sleepovers. For the first 2 or 3 months, everything was peaceful. Then one morning at breakfast, my mom asked my dad if he could take some boxes up to the attic hold things she didn't need around the house. My dad wasn't thrilled about it. None of us had spent much time in the attic. We had taken a quick look when we moved in and found it covered in inches of dust. There were a couple of old cupboards and an iron bed frame with wire springs, but no mattress. My mom and Gran speculated that it had once been a maid's or a nanny's room from when the house was originally built. Up until that moment, the attic had been silent, but once my dad put those boxes up there, everything changed. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I was woken by loud banging on my bedroom door. I got up and opened it to find my 2 brothers standing there with a flashlight, their faces pale with fear. Before I could ask what was wrong, I heard a massive crash from the attic, like something heavy had been slammed onto the floor. My brothers and I froze. Jamie whispered, "You heard it too, right? What's going on?" I tried to reassure them, saying it was probably just Dad moving more stuff around up there. Adrian shook his head. "At this time of night? No way. He has work in the morning." We sat there for a moment debating what to do when suddenly the noises exploded into chaos. It sounded like everything in the attic was being thrown around the room at once. That was it. We bolted downstairs to our parents' room. As we burst in, we saw that they were already half awake, having heard the noises themselves. My dad was about to yell at us for making so much noise until he realized that the sounds were still coming from above. A minute later, Gran arrived, her face pale. For her to have heard it at all was shocking. She had severe hearing loss. We all stood there, listening as the attic shook with violent bangs and thuds. It sounded like someone had lifted the old bed and thrown it across the room. My mom begged my dad to go check, but he wasn't going alone. Armed with flashlights and a cricket bat, we all reluctantly followed him upstairs. The moment we reached the stairs leading to the attic, the noises stopped instantly. My dad hesitated, then stepped back down a few steps. The noises started again. Climbing up to the attic landing, he tripped over a pile of boxes. My mom gasped when she saw them. They were the same boxes she had asked him to put in the attic. She turned to him and said, "Why didn't you put them up there like I asked?" He swore he had. I put them in the attic and locked the door behind me. None of us could understand. If someone had moved the boxes, we would have heard them walking across the attic floor, but we hadn't. My mom, looking shaken, told Dad to put the boxes in the spare room downstairs for the night. The moment we did that, the house fell silent.
For the first time in hours, we all slept soundly. The next day, my parents talked it over. My dad was still convinced someone had moved the boxes. My mom pointed out that if someone had gone into the attic, they would have left tracks in the thick dust. Determined to prove it was just a prank, my dad grabbed the attic key and took us all back upstairs. We watched as he unlocked the attic door and pulled it open. Inside, the dust was completely undisturbed, except for a small clear spot just inside the door where my dad had dropped the boxes. He had barely stepped inside. There were no footprints, no signs that anything had moved. Yet the night before, it had sounded like the entire attic was being torn apart. We had no explanation. That night, as an experiment, we put the boxes back in the attic. The noises started up again as before. The moment we moved the boxes downstairs, everything went quiet. That was the last straw for my dad. He banned anyone from using the attic for storage. Months later, my brother Adrian decided to test his luck. He dared to go up the attic stairs alone. As soon as he reached the top, something shoved him hard. He nearly fell backward down the stairs. That was it. My dad took action. He bricked up the entrance to the attic. We never went back up there again. We lived in the house for 2 more years, but it never truly felt like home. There was always a heavy, unwelcoming presence. When my grandmother passed away, my dad's job required us to move to Birmingham, and we were relieved to leave that house behind. We still don't know what was in the attic. Whatever it was, it didn't want us there. Even now, after everything I've learned about ghosts and the paranormal, I wouldn't go back to that attic. Whatever was up there was angry, and to this day, it still terrifies me. When my boyfriend and I moved into a bigger apartment in our building, we were excited. Our old neighbor, a sweet elderly man who loved telling stories about his younger days, had recently moved out due to his declining health. He had been diagnosed with cancer, and shortly after he left, the apartment became available. When the opportunity to upgrade presented itself, we didn't hesitate. For the first few months, things were mostly normal. There were odd feelings, a certain restlessness at night, an occasional sense of unease, but we brushed it off. It was an old building after all. The occasional creaks, drafts, and plumbing noises were easy enough to explain. Then we adopted a dog, and things changed. He was restless at night, often growling at nothing. We assumed it was just him adjusting to a new home, getting used to the unfamiliar sounds of apartment life. We had no reason to think otherwise, at least not at first. After a while, sleep became harder. I would wake up petrified for no reason. The simple task of getting up for water became a mental battle. I had never been afraid of the dark, but suddenly, I found myself turning on every single light as I walked through the apartment. Eventually, I even got sheer curtains for our bedroom, just so I wouldn't feel like something was watching me when I finally opened my eyes. I finally opened up to my boyfriend about it, and his reaction surprised me. He admitted that he had been feeling the same way. Sometimes he felt like something was watching him. A sudden chill would run down his spine, and he'd get the urge to turn on the lights but force himself not to. The relief I felt knowing I wasn't alone in this was overwhelming. Then, on the 27th of June, we were informed that our old neighbor had passed away. We had all cared about him deeply, and the news hit us hard. A few days later, we attended his funeral. That night, after coming home, we had a drink in his memory, sharing stories and laughing about the tales he used to tell.
That night, something shifted. The apartment felt hollow, empty in a way it never had before. It was ice cold, and the air seemed thicker than usual. At the time, we assumed it was just grief, the weight of knowing he was truly gone. At around 2 a.m., I woke up feeling thirsty. I got out of bed and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I stood at the sink, I suddenly heard mumbling. The sound came from the entryway. I shook my head, trying to wake myself up. Maybe my boyfriend had said something in his sleep. I refilled the glass, assuming that he had asked me for water. Then, as I turned to leave, our dog suddenly jumped off the bed. He ran straight to the entryway, growling. Before I could react, I heard the mumbling again, but this time it was clearer and closer. My dog let out a low, threatening growl and then ran back to my side, standing between me and the entryway. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I pushed the feeling away. I walked back into the bedroom, shaking my boyfriend awake and handing him the glass of water. He took it gratefully, drank drank from it, and then handed it back to me. I laughed and said, "Next time, use your big boy voice when you ask for water." His response sent a chill through me. I didn't ask for water. My hands froze as I set the glass on the nightstand. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I heard you mumbling." He frowned. "I thought you called the dog. I heard you whispering to him." The room fell silent. My body went ice cold as everything clicked into place. Something had spoken, and our dog had responded. That night, we pulled the curtains closed around the bed and left the lights on. The next morning, we tried to pretend nothing had happened. We went to breakfast, ran errands, and went about our day as if the night before hadn't completely terrified us. But as we headed home, I finally snapped. I went on a rant about how unnerving and horrifying the experience had been. My boyfriend sighed in relief. He had been just as scared as I was. The next few days were tense, but eventually we started falling back into a routine. The uneasiness lingered, but we convinced ourselves it was over. Then one morning, it happened again. My boyfriend had gotten up and jumped into the shower, like he did every morning. I was lying in bed, fully awake, debating whether I wanted 10 more minutes of rest or if I should get up and take the dog out. The dog was at the foot of the bed, having a restless dream. He was kicking, whimpering, and giving short growls. Just as I decided to get up, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. A sudden numbness spread through my body. I didn't see anything, but I knew something was behind me. Before I could move, the dog suddenly woke up and growled. It was a deep, guttural growl, one I had never heard from him before. My hand clenched into the pillow as my eyes burned with tears of pure fear. Then I heard Ito raspy, deep voice whispered clearly in my ear, "Get out!" Every instinct in me screamed to run. In a flash, I was on my feet, heart pounding. Before I knew it, I was yelling at the top of my lungs, "Leave us alone!" Seconds later, my boyfriend rushed into the room, towel around his waist, staring at me. His face turned pale. "Did you take the dog out already?" he asked, confused. I shook my head, no. "Why?" His voice dropped to a whisper. I heard the front door open and close. We stared at each other, the realization sinking in. Something else was here, and it hadn't left. It hadn't gotten better. If anything, it was getting worse. I set up my Sony handheld camcorder on a wall-mounted shelf facing the door to my room. The camera was positioned across the room to capture anyone entering or leaving. I didn't have a particular reason for doing this. I just liked recording random things from time to time. After setting it to record, I left my room, making sure to open and close the door behind me. My daughter had mentioned wanting to go to the store for some drinks, so I asked if she was ready. She said she needed more time to get ready, so I told her to let me know when she was ready to go. I went back to my room, opened the door, closed it behind me, and sat down at my computer to watch a movie I had saved. I watched for about 3 to 5 minutes with the volume turned up. My Sony camcorder records both video and audio, so everything happening in the room should have been captured. Eventually, I turned off the movie, walked back to my door, opened it, left, and closed it behind me. I headed toward my daughter's room just as she was coming in through the other door. Her room had 2 doors, and she looked at me and said someone was at the front door. I asked who it was, and she said she didn't know, just that it was a man. I figured it must be the internet repair guy since our internet and phone had gone out the night before and we had called in a service request. I went to the front door, and sure enough, it was the repair technician. He said he needed to check the fiber optics battery box, which was located inside my room. We walked back to my room, I opened the door, and we went inside and closed the door behind us. Since my electric wall heater was running, he checked the box, saw the green light on, and said it looked okay. We left the room, went outside, and he checked the fiber optics box on the exterior of the house. After testing it with a meter, he said it wasn't getting any power from the battery box inside. So he went back inside, back into my room, and he opened the battery backup box. He inspected it and told me it wasn't working properly and needed to be replaced. We left the room again, went back outside, and he went to his truck to get a new box. Once he returned, we entered my room again, and he installed the new battery backup. It only took about 10 minutes to replace. Afterward, we left my room once again, went back outside, and he checked the exterior box one last time. This time, the lights were on, meaning everything was working. Our internet and phone were back up. Remember, the entire time my camcorder was recording my door. It should have captured every single time I entered and exited my room, including all the times the repair guy was with me. A little while later, my daughter and I went to the store. By the time we got back, my camcorder battery had died while still recording. I plugged it into charge, then copied the video to my computer and started watching it. The recording was 37 minutes long, and all I could see was my door. No one was in the footage one. Not me, not the repairman. Not a single time did the camera capture us entering or leaving the room. But I could hear everything the sound of my fish tank bubbler running, the loud rattling of my wall heater turning on and off, and even the faint background noises from outside. The camera's audio was working fine, yet visually, nothing changed. The door never moved on camera, even though I had opened and closed it multiple times. The repairman had come and gone at least 3 times. I'd gone in and out several times as well. I even left the door open at one point while going to the bathroom, and yet the camera captured none of it. There is no logical explanation for this. The camera recorded continuously until the battery drained. It picked up all the sounds, but somehow it never saw us. It was as if we were never there. I have the video to prove either, rather. The video that proves nothing. It should have shown everything, but instead it shows nothing at all. As I sat working on my stories, I heard the unmistakable sound of silverware clattering in the kitchen. My husband was upstairs, engrossed in his video game, and our son was at his girlfriend's place in Medina. I called out to our little Shih Tzu, Jojo, thinking he might have knocked something over, but he didn't budge from under the table. Clearly it wasn't him. Lately, strange things have been happening more frequently. Earlier that day, I went upstairs to use the bathroom. When I came out, I noticed the office door, which I always keep shut, was wide open. More concerning was that the light in my bedroom was on, even though I had turned it off along with the television when I went downstairs for my morning coffee. I shouted down to my husband, "Charlie, were you just upstairs?" He replied that he hadn't been. I mentioned the open office door and suggested maybe a breeze had caused it, but he pointed out that the door opens inward, so a breeze couldn't have pushed it open from inside the room. That didn't make sense. Yesterday, while I was sitting at the dining table writing, the closet door across from me creaked open. I looked up and stared at it for a moment before my husband walked out of the kitchen and saw it too. He joked, "Are you done in there?" Before pushing the door shut and walking away. Not even a minute later, it swung open again. Charlie sighed, got up, and made sure nothing was pressing against it from the inside. He tested the latch, jiggled the handle, and shut it firmly. He even tugged on it to ensure it was completely closed before heading upstairs. I sat there, staring at the door. There's no basement in this house. The floor beneath our carpet is solid concrete. No loose floorboards, no drafts. Yet, that door seems to have a mind of its own. An hour later, I was multitasking, writing and making candles. I believe that the energy, whether positive or negative, can transfer into them. As I poured the wax, Jojo started growling at the stairs. His small body stiffened, and his gaze was locked onto something unseen. Then I heard a popping sound coming from the kitchen closet. I told myself it was just the furnace cooling down. The house is always freezing in the dining room, which is why I keep a small electric fireplace running. Still, Jojo wouldn't stop staring. Now he's sitting right next to me, tense, his eyes fixated on something just to my right. He's positioned himself between me and whatever he sees, as if he's protecting Mia Noble Act for a tiny dog. 3 nights ago, on Christmas, Charlie woke up at 2:45 a.m. to the sound of the kitchen cabinet slamming. He got up immediately and checked the house. Everything was locked and no windows were open. Jojo, who was curled up in bed with us, jolted awake and growled but refused to follow Charlie downstairs. That's when I realized that whenever I sit down to write, the activity increases. It's as if something stirs when I work on my stories. I keep catching movement in my peripheral vision, quick, shadowy figures flickering at the edges of my sight. But I have blackout curtains. There are no headlights from outside, no shadows from passing cars. None of this terrifies me. It unsettles me, sure, but there's something about it that intrigues me too. A part of me wonders if it could be my dad. My friend Dee moved into an old house complex in Salvador, Brazil. She was always surrounded by people, hosting gatherings, and I often visited her home as one of her closest friends. I even took care of her dog Fred whenever she traveled. The house itself had a solid structure but carried an eerie atmosphere. I later realized it was haunted. After experiencing multiple unexplainable events and learning more about its history, many who spent the night there had their own unsettling experiences. Being sensitive to the paranormal, I had more than my share of encounters. At first, it was just an uneasy feeling whenever I went into the kitchen alone. The next time I stayed over, Dee and her boyfriend R were home. I lay in bed, lights off, trying to sleep, but the same oppressive sensation crept over me. My bed was pushed up against the wall, and suddenly I felt a cold gust brush past my arm. Then a voice whispered in my head, "What are you doing here?" I concentrated, trying to visualize who or what was speaking. Again, I saw a man, dark-skinned, but his face was hidden from me. I prayed until the feeling subsided and finally fell asleep. Over time, the experiences intensified. I heard the laughter and cries of unseen children, footsteps in empty hallways, and loud bangs against the walls. Sometimes the air would turn icy cold, and Fred would bark furiously at nothing. Dee never believed me. She was a skeptic, brushing everything off as imagination. But 6 months in, things took a turn. R started changing. He became moody, aggressive, and cruel, not only to her but to their friends and even Fred. He was always angry, lashing out unpredictably. I told Dee the house needed a blessing, but instead of calling a priest, she invited a candomblé wizard. That only made things worse. R spiraled deeper into his rage, growing more violent. One evening, Dee's mother visited, and we got to talking about the house. She hesitantly admitted she had felt something sinister in the guest bedroom, the same room where I had been spoken to by the unseen entity. She described an overwhelming feeling of being unwelcome, as though something didn't want her there. I told her everything I had experienced, convinced that a dark presence was attached to the house. That night, I fell asleep in the living room while watching television. I woke up to a horrifying sight. I was floating, looking down at myself asleep on the couch. Panicking, I turned toward the window and saw a young woman outside. She looked right at me and waved. I tried to wake up but couldn't. Then I turned and saw R standing over me. His expression was full of hatred, his eyes locked onto mine. My spirit struggled to return to my body, and when I finally did, I gasped awake, drenched in sweat. I prayed until morning. That was the moment I knew whatever haunted that house had latched onto R, feeding his rage, twisting his thoughts. Soon after, Dee and R broke up, and she decided to move just across the street, still within the same complex. I helped her pack, dreading another night in that house. I left the lights on, trying to keep the darkness at bay, but that didn't stop the nightmares. I dreamed of a little boy, around 5 or 6 years old, running from my room to Dee's. He looked at me, crying, then disappeared. I rushed to her room and found her in tears. She hugged me and whispered, "Don't be afraid, I'm here to help you." Then I woke up, breathless. That's when I heard them footsteps pacing in my room. Praying under my breath, I tried to ignore the sounds, but they only grew louder. I grabbed a blanket and hurried to the living room, where Fred was sleeping. Lying on the couch, I closed my eyes, trying to will myself into sleep. That's when I heard a soft, eerie Huminga woman singing a lullaby. I clenched my fists, whispering, "Please God, make it stop," but it didn't. Then a voice echoed inside my head. "I'm not going to let you sleep." The night dragged on, the presence lingering until sunrise. I had never felt something so determined to torment me. It wasn't just haunting the house, it was targeting me. The next morning, we moved. Relief washed over us as we carried the last box across the street. But the question still haunted me. I needed answers. I went to the gatekeeper and asked if he knew anything about the house's past. His expression darkened. "No one stays in that house for long," he said. 10 years ago, a Padre Santo, a male candomblé priest, lived there. He performed all sorts of rituals, took clients for black magic work, and always wore a deep blue robe. My stomach dropped. I had seen him, felt him. His spirit was still there, lurking, influencing, feeding off the weak. Even now, when I visit Dee and sit on her porch, I feel the weight of those empty windows across the street. I can't shake the sensation that he's still there, watching, waiting,